Okay, let's change the view. All right. Well, morning. We are in chapter 23. I'm going to give you a page in just a second. Yes, so if it's chapter 23, we are going to be picking up on page, if you have the Eitz Chaim, 1122, page 1122. And we started some of this. There are a series of laws that have to do with who can be admitted to what's called Kahal Adonai. It's translated in the Eitz Chaim as the congregation of the Lord. And that makes it sound like it is the Jewish community as a whole. Another word that's used for this is the Eidah. Most scholars think that it is not the congregation, it is something called the assembly. And think of it as we might think of Congress. These are a group of people who are chosen from among the Israelites, and they have certain powers, legislative powers and other things. And so the question is whether one of these people can become part of that assembly. There are other people who think it's broader, but it seems clear that the thing about the assembly is that it entitles you to only a person who is eligible to be a part of this ruling body can own land. Everybody else is landless, and only a person eligible, if you have to be eligible in order to have land, your own land. You could be a farmer on someone else's land, for example, but in order to own land, you must be eligible for this assembly. Doesn't mean you have to be in it, but you have to be eligible to be in it. And in order to marry an Israelite, you also have to be eligible to be in it. So this is a subset of the community of Israel that has certain prerogatives that others don't. And one of those prerogatives, of course, is being part of the assembly, but you may or may not be. Okay, so we have a list, and the first one is a mamzer. We talked about that last time. This is a person who is the offspring of a marriage which could not happen. Specifically, the offspring of an adulterous or incestuous relationship. We talked about that some last time. It's problematic, of course, because in some sense we're thinking of punishing children for the sins of their parents. Doesn't mean, by the way, that someone wasn't considered part of the Jewish community, but there were limitations on who they could marry and so on. So the one thing I said at the end of last class that I want to just come back and focus on for 1 minute is the whole issue of Jewish divorce. And I'll explain why that's relevant here. But there are sort of a couple of things. The first is that according to Jewish law, if you were married Jewishly, you need to be divorced Jewishly, right? In other words, if you have a Jewish marriage and then you get a secular divorce, you are divorced in the eyes of the state, but in Jewish terms, you're still married. Now, some people care about that, some people don't, right? But from the Jewish point of view, since you're still married, if you now go and marry someone else, which the state will be, pleased to have you do, the children of that second marriage would be considered illegitimate because it would be viewed in Jewish terms as an adulterous relationship. So, why am I mentioning this? Because the concern is, beyond anything else, that the offspring of that second marriage, which you could easily enter into just by not knowing these things, right, would also be considered to be a mamzer, someone who is disqualified in these ways. And that's why one of the reasons why rabbis push hard, I think, for people to get a get. Unfortunately, of course, there are issues around a get, husbands who refuse to give their wives a get, hold them up for various rights or financial things. The conservative movement has really worked hard on that problem, both by putting a clause in the ketubah, which says that a husband who divorces his wife civilly can be compelled, in fact, by the state to give her a get. And even in extreme cases, there can be a retroactive nullification of the first marriage, which would, of course, mean that they were never married. They were living together, as it were. They were never married, and therefore, the second marriage, it would not be considered adulterous. Okay, so just a little bit more about this concept of mamzer in the way that it's sort of contemporary concern. I want to go on to pick up the next of these laws about who can come into the kahal, this legislative body. And what we're being told here is that an Amorite or a Moabite, someone from the people of Ammon and the people of Moab, cannot be admitted to the assembly, not their descendants, even to the 10th generation. And there's a reason, there's a historical reason for this. Why? Because when the Israelites were leaving Egypt and on their way to the promised land, they refused food and water to this people as they were coming through, refused to allow them food and water, to purchase food and water. And in specifically, in the case of the Moabites, they hired Bilam, this non-Jewish prophet, who was considered extremely efficacious, to curse the people. And that did not work, of course, because God transformed their curses into blessings. It's a wonderful story. You can find it in the book of Numbers. Involves, among other things, a talking donkey. So if you don't know the story, I certainly suggest you check it out. And then we are not only don't they get to come into the community of Israel, that is to own land and to be part of the assembly and to marry within the greater Jewish community, but you should not be concerned with their welfare or benefit, which is to say, the Hebrew words are shalom and tova, the goodness and the welfare of this community. So a rather harsh and, it's unclear. It says till the 10th generation. It's a very long time. And it's really unclear why, that the historical memory of this refusal to be hospitable is now supposed to be carried on for generations. It really is, in my mind, unclear. It does seem clear, right in biblical sources, that it was ignored. And the most famous case is Ruth, who gets a whole book of the Bible, and it's a wonderful book. Another thing I'd recommend you read. Ruth is referred to again and again as a Moabite. Not only does she marry Boaz, who is an Israelite and a very well-regarded Israelite, but their descendant is King David and ultimately the Messiah. So not only isn't this Moabite woman excluded, but she becomes, this she has this extraordinary privileged place within the Jewish people. And she seems to have gained that in part by her personal qualities. She's the embodiment of chesed, of kindness and goodness, particularly in the way she treats her mother-in-law. The Talmud tries to get around this, and it says, well, the Moabites they're only talking about the men, not the women. That seems extraordinarily unlikely because the Moabite women were the ones who tried to lure the Israelite men, away from the religion of Israel. So to say, well, for the bad things they did in the past, they can't come into the assembly, and the women could.
Sorry to interrupt you, Rabbi, but there is some sort of noise.
Right. So
very annoying.
Thank you. Someone is not muted. And I would ask everybody to please mute. Thank you, Myra, for pointing it out. Okay, so here we have the Moabites and the Edomites, but there are those who can come in. You should not abhor an Edomite. He is your kinsman. So who are the Edomites? The people of Edom. They are biblically the descendants of Esau, right? So your kinsman here, literally your brother, right? Since we are the descendants of Jacob, and Jacob's brother was Esau, even though they have a terrible relationship, right? Nonetheless, they are part of, we have a tie to them, and therefore we should not, it says, don't abhor. It's a hard word to translate, but the sense here is in counter-distinction to the people of Edom and Moab, right? And it's quite striking, especially since the descent, according to rabbinic tradition, the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, become Rome, the great enemy of the Jewish people who martyrs the rabbis, and destroys the temple, and so on. So, I don't know quite what they make of this verse, but it is striking that this tie of blood seems to overcome the sense of brotherhood. And then we get one of the most remarkable laws I know of, and that is, you shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land, and children of them can be admitted into the assembly in the third generation. Now, remember, at least in context, Moses is talking to the children of those who came out of Egypt. These are the children that the Egyptians oppressed. Deep, right? It killed their babies, and so on. And so this statement that no, you were strangers in their land is extraordinary, it seems to me. And the idea, by the way, of being strangers in their land is that we went during the time of famine, right? Joseph went first, and then he brought his whole family into Egypt, where they were sustained. And since we as aliens came into Egypt and were provided for, we owe them a certain debt. And that to me is interesting because in some sense, looking back in this case, and it's hard to find a people who have oppressed us so much, we are to remember the good, right? We're to remember the good that they did, and the evil that they did is overcome in a certain sense, by the good that they did. And that, to me, given that situation, is remarkable. The modern analogy for me is, Germany and the people of Germany today. I remember that my father, who was in the Second World War, would, never buy a German car. It was unthinkable as far as he was concerned. He bought foreign cars, but he was not, and he spoke with derision about those who did. And that sense, which was perhaps understandable in that generation, and maybe that's even why they're talking about the third generation who can come into the assembly. Nonetheless, the Egyptians did pay for what they did. And in Germany, by the way, they provided reparations, and a great deal of them, unlike, for example, Poland. So there is this sense that good can actually balance out evil, at least moving forward. Okay, so I've talked about a bunch of stuff, and I am going to open it up if people have questions, and we're going to start with Marilyn and then Michael. You'll then Barry. You have to unmute. Marilyn, unmute.
Could you please tell me what page we're on?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry. Yes, we're on page 1123, 1123.
I got things to do.
Good. Michael.
An analogy also to what you were saying, that there was some good to the slavery in Egypt because they took us in and did nice things. Some right-wing politicians were saying there was some good in slavery, that they were taught trades that they could use after the war.
Yes.
It's saying there's good in doing evil.
Right. So there is no sense in which the oppression in Egypt, the enslavement of the people, was considered good.
Right. I understand
that would be the analogy. If you wanted to, people who are saying, oh, slavery wasn't so bad, they learned valuable skills, right? That was the comment that was made. There's no sense in the Jewish tradition that slavery was good for our people. If the question is retrospectively, what is our attitude going to be? I mean, you could make the case, the South was deeply involved. Should we hate the Northwest too, right? But what do we do with the fact that they fought against us in the Civil War? And so, right, there comes a point at which, despite that oppression, despite the horrors of it, one can see the good as well as the bad. But that's not to say the Jewish community views slavery in any sense positively in terms of what the Egyptians did to us.
Oh, that's a given now, yeah.
Okay, Barry, you had a comment.
Yes, a few things. For one thing, the Moabites and the Ammonites are descendants of the daughters of Lot.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Interestingly, that
they're
also the descendants.
They are descendants
through
well, go ahead.
Through Lot. So they're actually through there was an incest.
Yes. The story is that after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the daughters of Lot, in some sense, thought that the three of them were the only survivors. At least that was the argument that they made. They wanted to repopulate, and they got their father drunk, and they went in. The etymologies of the name Moab is Mayav, from father. Right. So that gives you that sense of it. Good point. Thank you. Other questions, comments before we go?
Yes, I have something else. Is there a sense of conversion in
I'm sorry, I'm having
Judaism?
to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's a sense of conversion.
So the whole
Because
issue,
so, is that, would that be
well,
kind of a
you know,
workaround? So if you're a bastard, then you convert.
so the idea of becoming an Israelite is in some sense becoming part of the assembly gives you certain rights, and the idea would seem to be that you have to at least have faith in the God of Israel in order to do that. The whole question of conversion in biblical times is really unclear. It doesn't seem to be what we think of as conversion. Remember, by the way, that a woman who the identity of a woman seems to be derived either from her father or her husband. So a non-Jewish, non-Israelite woman who marries an Israelite, in some sense, gets subsumed under his identity. It seems that way anyway. But yes and no. So we look at the case of Ruth, who is the most famous case of conversion that we have in the Bible. Ruth, remember, married to the son of Naomi. Naomi has come with her husband to the land of Moab. She's a Moabite. And the husband dies, both of the sons die, and she says to her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, she says, go back to your people, go back to your mothers, go back with your life, because I'm going back to Israel, to Bethlehem. And Orpah does, and Ruth says, don't tell me to leave you. Wherever you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. Right? And that seems to be what's necessary for her to become an Israelite. And she marries Boaz. Right? It's clearly considered legitimate. So her statement itself. Now, rabbinic literature goes to town in analyzing what she says in order to find in it something much more formal in conversion. To give you one example, Ruth tells Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws to go back, and she tells them 3 times. And so the rabbinic tradition is, if someone comes to you wanting to convert, you should discourage them 3 times. Now, how much is that followed anymore? Not very much. My own approach to conversion was just to give people a lot of reading. Because there was a lot they needed to know, but also if they weren't serious, it would discourage them if they did. This wasn't important to them, right? But particularly in this day of rampant intermarriage, the idea that someone wants to be Jewish and help to establish a Jewish home tends to be something which we look upon favorably and aren't busy discouraging it. Nonetheless, in rabbinic times, there's, by the way, the Talmud has this remarkable statement where it talks about actually what should you say to someone. And they say, I don't remember the exact language, but do you know that the Jewish people are despised and oppressed in every generation? And the person says, I know, and I'm not worthy. It's a remarkable statement. So in a sense, you're discouraging this person by saying, do you know what anti-Semitism is? I always think about this today when people convert. Do you know what you're getting into, right? So that for the rabbi, and then the person who says, I know and I'm not worthy, may be referring to the fact that people in Roman times and later on in various places, if you converted someone to Judaism, it could be at risk of your own life. And so someone who says to the rabbi who they wish to convert with, I know and I'm not worthy, suggests that perhaps what they're saying is, I know there's a risk for you, and I'm not worthy that you should risk that. Nonetheless, I need to be Jewish, right? Anyway, the long answer to a short question. And that's not unusual, as you know. Sandy,
Okay, thank you.
did you have your hand up? No. Okay. Any other comments? Otherwise, we're going back to the text. Seeing none. Okay.
A
So,
question.
yeah, go
I have a
ahead.
question. I'm sorry. I put my hand up with the computer, that yellow hand, because I'm never sure when I'm
Oh,
interrupting.
yeah, I'd
people.
never look at that.
Oh, sorry. I'll just
Okay.
blab when I need to. So my question is, you were talking about when, I guess in an extreme case, when a man does not want to give his wife a get, they can be ordered to, and one of the solutions could be that the marriage could be dissolved as if it never happened.
Yes.
So if they have children, do those children become mamzer?
No.
Good,
So,
because that was one thing I was curious about.
so let me go back to what I said previously and make it even clearer. A mamzer is only the offspring of a relationship that would not be legal. Now, the first marriage was legal, right? A couple that has a child together without benefit of marriage, that child is legitimate as any other Jewish child, right? It's very, we tend to use the word bastard as any child who's, not true. And in fact, the Jewish attitude towards couples living together in a committed relationship and having a child without benefit of marriage is kind of a wink and a nod. It's marriage is viewed as a form of protection, and particularly for women,
Yes.
right? Because it ensured that first of all, she had certain marital rights, and they're specified in the ketubah. And in the case of a divorce, there was a settlement. He couldn't simply divorce her and leave her destitute, and that also was in the ketubah. So marriage was considered desirable and important, and lifted the relationship. The word for marriage in Hebrew is kiddushin, which means holy, right? It elevates that relationship to a much higher plane. It becomes more sacred. But the idea that, okay, they were together, they slept together, they had a child, there is no stigma at all attached to that child.
Okay, so even though we're pretending the marriage never happened because the husband doesn't want to give her a get, the children don't lose their status.
Not at all.
That's that's really what my
All right.
question
And
is. Okay,
this
thank you.
idea is this idea of retroactive annulment, which is controversial, certainly not accepted within Orthodox circles, but it's based on the idea that marriage is in some sense a transaction, right, between two parties, and all transactions are, at least in theory, done with the approval of a Jewish court. Theoretically, you don't actually get a beit din and ask them, can we get married? But if in the Talmud, theoretically, it's under the aegis or permission of the court, and there's a principle in general: anything that a court can authorize, it can annul. So using that very thin kind of argumentation, because it's a huge problem, right? And there an attempt to find a remedy. And remember that there's the other remedy, which is widely accepted, which is that you put a clause in the ketubah. But if they didn't have such a clause, what then? So every attempt is made to get this couple to have this divorce, but if not, as an extreme measure, that's what can be done.
Thank you.
Okay, going to move on now. Having talked about the enemy, I get a couple of very odd laws. And the first one has to do with the military and going to battle. So, ki tetzeh lemilchama, when you go out to battle against your enemies, be on guard it says anything untoward, but the Hebrew is mikol davar ra, from any bad thing. And now we're going to get some sense of what those bad things are. If any among you has been rendered impure by nocturnal emission, he must leave the camp and must not re-enter. Toward evening, he shall bathe in water, and at sundown, he may re-enter the camp. Okay, so the idea seems to be that this emission will somehow pollute the camp. And the concept here is that there is a sense that, and we're going to see it at the end, right? It says, since the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you, let it be holy. Right? There is a sense, we say Adonai ish milchama in the Song of the Sea, God is a God of war. There is a sense that God is present among the army, that God is fighting for them, and therefore certain rules of purity, which are necessary in the presence of God, are therefore apply to this army camp. And this idea of an emission as being disqualifying or making a person impure, right? You can see in the revelation at Mount Sinai. 3 days before God comes down on Mount Sinai and gives the Torah, 3 days before, Moses is said to tell them, prepare, wash your clothing, don't go near a woman. Why? It's really a euphemism for don't have sex during these 3 days, because there might be an admission. And that somehow, in the minds of ancient Israel, renders someone ritually impure, and you don't want that within the camp where God will be present, right? Now, I want to, though it's parenthetic, I want to mention something which is somewhat related, and I think it's important. If you ask people why women were not allowed to have an aliyah, of course, this is not an issue for conservative Judaism anymore. It's not even an issue for modern Orthodox, except they do it in a woman's minyan without men present. But if you ask, why couldn't a woman have an aliyah? The answer that many people will give is that it's because she has a period, right? And therefore, it's a kind of a mission, and therefore, she shouldn't be in contact with the Torah, which is, after all, a holy thing. Right? Using this same kind of analogy. Okay, I want to say that's absolute nonsense. It's not true. A woman does not defile a Torah. And the reason you know it's not true is from this verse, because if it were true, then a man who slept with his wife the night before or had a dream with a nocturnal, he couldn't come either, right? That's the concept, right? Now, the reasons why women did, and more than that, there's a wonderful medieval source that asks the following question, right? The Kohen is supposed to have the first aliyah. What if everybody's a Kohen? What do? There's nobody else in the community. Who should have the first aliyah? And there's a medieval posek, decisor, who says the woman. Let a woman have the first aliyah. And there are other statements in the Talmud itself, which seems to say that a woman could in some circumstances. So it has absolutely nothing to do with this sense that a woman becomes impure because she has menstrual blood. Okay, again, not what's being discussed here, but it's one of my pet peeves that I hear people say this, and it's simply an old wives' tale, or in this case, maybe an old husband's tale. Who knows? Okay, the other thing that's going to disqualify, which is very strange, and I don't know what to make of it, is that there needs to be an area outside the camp where you may relieve yourself, right? The idea that you wouldn't defecate within the camp, because that somehow disqualify, will make it less holy. Seems very strange. And you're supposed to carry some kind of spear or spike so that when you actually defecate outside the camp, you can dig a hole and you'll cover it up. Again, I don't know what this is about. I don't know anybody who does know. I mean, I've done a fair amount of research. I don't know anybody who does. It doesn't seem to be a problem in the temple, right? So why it's a problem here, this seems to reflect some kind of an ancient tradition about purity. The place where you see this kind of thinking about purity is in the scrolls of the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This sect, very, I wouldn't even use the word pietistic. They have an extremely stringent view of holiness. And there are references there among the Essene texts to the idea that one should go outside the city. And I've always found this remarkably weird because, I don't know how big the camp is, right? But most of us, only have a certain limited amount of control. And if you have to go a great distance, I don't know. Be that as it may, this is the law. And I think the takeaway from this is not so much these specific regulations as that God is present among the people who are fighting a righteous cause. And I was thinking about this particularly this last Shabbat in the synagogue that I go to, where we've been reciting a prayer not only for the soldiers of Israel, modern Israel today, at Shabbat services, but every service. I was the evening service the other night because it was my father's yard site, and there too, this is recited, and the language of God will go with you and fight for you is in that prayer, right? And for me at least, in this horrible battle against Hamas, which in some ways is a modern embodiment of evil, the idea that God is fighting with us and that this is, despite the awful, awful things that are happening to the people there, this is nonetheless a legitimate and holy cause. My takeaway from this passage, it has great resonance for me now, much more than it ever has before when I studied the passage. The next law is also quite surprising. And that is, you shall not turn over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from his master. Right? Fugitive slaves. Right? The United States, for example, had fugitive slave laws. You had to, if you found someone's escaped slave, that was their property. You had to return their property. Right? The Torah says, no, you don't return them. Not only, it doesn't say you don't have to. It says you can't. It is escaped slave who comes, and more than that, he shall live with you in any place he may choose, among the settlements in your midst, wherever he pleases. He gets to choose. Right? He has the protection of the state. He can't be returned, and he gets to choose. Now, he doesn't become a citizen, right? He's not going to own land. He becomes like a resident alien. And because he's vulnerable, because he's like any other ger toshav, resident alien, just as we say it there, we say it here, you must not ill-treat him, right? Don't take advantage of his status. Now, who are these fugitive slaves? The assumption is that they're not Israelites, or at least not, because an Israelite slave would not, there are two assumptions here. One is they get out after 6 years anyway, and that there are all kinds of laws about how they have to be well treated. So this is referring, most scholars think, to a non-Israelite slave. And the protection given to this escaped slave, I think, is unparalleled in antiquity. And not just antiquity, up until, the 19th century, where you must give them refuge. And in fact, you have to treat them okay, and they get to pick where they want to live. So I want to stop here once again. I will open up the view. Comments on God in the camp, nocturne, all of this, not hating the Egyptian, anything else? Myra, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, going back to a woman not being able to touch the Torah, what would they say about the women who are older, like me, who don't get their periods anymore?
Right. No, I
What's the answer to that?
it's a good question. I just think, they're not, it's not really, it's kind of an after the fact justification, and it really vilifies women. I mean, it's really that there's something inherently biologically wrong, which keeps you from being in this sacred place. So, I mean, there are specific reasons why women were disqualified. And since we're on this subject, I'll just mention one. Originally, when you were called to the Torah, you didn't just come up and say blessings. The first person who was called to the Torah said the blessing before the reading and read. The second person read, the third person read, and up through the aliyot, whether it's 5 on a holiday, 6 on Yom Kippur, 7 on Shabbat. And the last person would say the concluding blessing. Right, so there was a blessing before the Torah reading, there was a blessing after the Torah reading, like we have with the Haftorah today. Now that is extremely problematic because it's not easy to read from the Torah. Right? Yeah, there's no vowels, there's no trup. You really have to be fairly learned to do that. And if only a person who can read can be honored, then a lot of people are not going to get aliyot. Right? It's going to be a very small group of people. So in rabbinic times, there was something. It's interesting, we're talking about this because we're going to see another example of it. So, something was done called a takana. So a takana literally means a fix, that affix it. Right? So what's the takana? They said, we have to change this so that more people will be able to come up and be honored at the Torah. And so what are we going to do? What we do now. There'll be an official reader, or perhaps a series of them. But the average person doesn't have to be able to read Torah. They can come up, they'll say a blessing before and after what the reader does. That was a very radical thing, by the way, because there's a prohibition against saying extraneous blessings, because they could be considered a blessing in vain. So if you go and add all these blessings in between, that's not trivial, right? But this is part of, I think, of a general tendency in Judaism to become more and more democratic and more inclusive. Before this takana, when you had to actually read, there is an assumption that if you're going to call a woman up, the men can't. They can't do it, right? And that casts dispersions on the community. The Talmud's reason why a woman can't come to the Torah is not because she's impure, but because it'll say bad things about the community. Right? Now, why is that? I just gave you one suggestion. I don't know, maybe it's something else. But the justification for women coming to the Torah is a community gets to determine its own honor. What somebody else might think is a dishonor, we can think is an honor. It's subjective. Calling women to the Torah was not a huge innovation at all. There's lots of precedent for it, the good arguments for it. Including women in a minyan was much more complicated. It was a much bigger deal. Although, interestingly enough, and now I'm really off on a tangent, in some communities, they were happy to count a woman to the minyan because they needed minions. But to call a woman up to the Torah, which was very public, they were unwilling to do that. Even though halachically, calling a woman up to the Torah was not such a big deal, counting the minyan was a big deal. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Well, you said before about the runaway slave. You have to, you cannot return him. I mean, he could choose where he wants to live. What does that mean? He couldn't say, "I want to live in so and so's home" as a guest.
No. Remember that we're thinking of a tribal society. Because the tribe of Dan has an allocation in the north, and the tribe of Judah, and so on. And so the idea is and this is not a person who, if he's a foreigner, right, he doesn't have any lineage, right? So where does he go? Does he go to the allocation of Dan? Does he go to the allocation of Judah? Where does he go? He gets to decide, right? Not that he can live somebody's property.
It didn't make sense,
right? But you can imagine someone who says, "We don't want those people here."
Yeah, I can imagine that.
And the Torah is saying, you can't say that. Not in my neighborhood, right? You can't say that.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's really the importance. Other questions? Yeah, Marilyn.
How long did these rules and regulations last?
How
did they go on for many centuries?
Yes, I think it's a good question, but you have to look at each individual law. Some of them go on up until modern times, in fact, and others really have a certain life and they end. This whole process, rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that we live, is not the Judaism of the Bible. And it's important to stress that we are rabbinic Jews. Our religion, biblical religion, is all about sacrifices. It's all about purity and impurity. We don't make sacrifices anymore. We have prayers now, taking the place of sacrifice. All of that is created by the rabbis, right? Think about the Passover Seder. There's no Seder in the Torah. You're supposed to eat the lamb. And mention the Exodus from Egypt. We don't eat the lamb, right? And we have a whole ritual created by the rabbis. So the question whether these laws continue is really a question of how they make it through the rabbinic period, and also how the rabbis interpret their meaning. And the rabbinic interpretation, well, I just gave you an example about the Moabites, right? So can a Moabite come in? Well, it seems in the biblical period they already were. Look at Ruth. But on the other hand, rabbinic exegesis wants to limit that, and so on. So the answer is it differs among laws, and it's really unclear. You have to look at each individual law, and sometimes it's not even clear if you do. Other questions, Sandy?
So, Rabbi, do you think what you were saying before about a woman who had her period would not be able to read from the Torah or an honor, whatever, is related to the fact, the way Judaism looks at blood in general, with the sacrifices, you're unclean, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because the relationship between semen and blood is a clear one. They both render you ritually impure. I don't like the word unclean because you're not. You're just excluded from certain rituals. So I don't think so. And if it were the case that it was about menstruation, I think it would say so. You know, it's much less clear. And you know, again, the Torah, the Talmud permits it under certain circumstances, and so I don't think so.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so we are just about out of time, which is unfortunate because I was really looking forward to talking about ritual prostitution, but it will have to wait. See, I'm giving you a teaser. Next time, we're going to talk about ritual prostitution, and we're going to talk about lending money for interest, among other laws, which were both fascinating. So I do want to say a couple of things. I will be sending out the recording. Along with the recording, I mentioned this last time, I'll mention it again. And no one's under any obligation to do it. If you want to help to sponsor this class, over the course of the class this year, there are about 35 sessions. And if you'd like to sponsor it and contribute to it, I would suggest $180, which is about $4 a session. No obligation to do that. If you want to do anything to contribute as a sponsor, I welcome it. In the email that I send out with the recording, I'll also be giving you information about that. But again, I just can't emphasize this enough. Not necessary. You're welcome, and more than welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. So it's just something I want to make available, and it's of course very helpful for me. So on that note,
Rabbi?
Yeah.
We want to wish you an early happy birthday.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Sing happy birthday to you.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm
Birthday.
turning 70 tomorrow. So which is shocking to me in the extreme, except for the fact that 70 is the new 50. So yeah, well, look, it's all about being in good health and being productive. And so on that level, at least for me, just another year. So thank you for your good wishes. And I will see you in my 71st year next week. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Good
Happy birthday.
Goodbye.